What if I told you that the dish most associated with Virginia comfort food, a thick stew built from whatever meat and vegetables a hunting party had on hand, was first cooked by a man named Jimmy Matthews in Brunswick County in 1828, that Virginia and Georgia have been fighting over who invented it for nearly a century, and that newspaper evidence settles the argument firmly in Virginia's favor? That a soup made from peanuts has been served continuously in Virginia taverns since the 1700s, brought not by English colonists, but carried across the Atlantic in the memory of enslaved West Africans who recognized a familiar legume growing in unfamiliar soil? Richmond, where the food has been quietly correct for 3 centuries and rarely bothers to explain itself. The stew itself goes back further than either state arguing about it. The Brunswick stew recipe most likely traces to southeastern Native American cooking. Squirrel, groundhog, hominy, deer, bear, corn, and squash simmered together in whatever vessel was available, a technique the indigenous peoples of the region had been using for generations before European contact. When colonists arrived, the same communities taught them how to grow corn and cook with what the land provided. The specific recipe that Virginia claims comes from Brunswick County, about an hour south of Richmond. First cooked by a man named James Jimmy Matthews as a squirrel stew, the recipe as it's recognized today was settled between 1816 and 1828, refined by a man named Ned Stith, who lived in the same county. Georgia's competing claim, a historical plaque on an iron pot on St. Simon's Island dating the dish to July 2, 1898, is 7 decades younger than the Virginia version, and newspapers were already writing about Brunswick stew in Virginia well before Georgia's claimed origin date. The 1988 Virginia General Assembly made it official, proclaiming Brunswick County the originator of Brunswick stew. Stewmasters, the title given to the cooks who have apprenticed for roughly a year under the supervision of an established master, still cook it at festivals across central Virginia, including the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. The stew today is built from chicken and pork rather than squirrel, simmered for hours with tomatoes, corn, lima beans, and okra until a wooden spoon can stand upright in the pot without falling. The peanut is not native to Virginia. It originated near the Incan Empire in South America, traveled to Africa with Portuguese traders, and was carried back across the Atlantic by enslaved West Africans, who recognized the legume immediately and knew exactly what to do with it. Peanut soup likely predates any written colonial recipe. Frank Clark, who oversees the historic foodways program at Colonial Williamsburg, has been direct about this. Peanuts were certainly eaten by enslaved people in Virginia before they were eaten by white colonists. The soup itself was probably styled after West African tomato-based soups, or a Sudanese-style soup made with bones, garlic, and rice. Recipes that enslaved cooks adapted using the ingredients available on Virginia plantations. What is documented is this. King's Arms Tavern opened in Williamsburg in 1772 and served a dish on its menu called creme of peanut soup. Peanuts at the time were still considered, by most Anglo-American tastemakers, to be food for pigs and enslaved people, rather than a delicacy fit for a tavern menu. The soup persisted anyway. George Washington and George Mason were both reportedly fond of it. The soup is rich, smooth, made from roasted peanuts pureed with stock and cream, garnished with chopped peanuts and a sprinkle of parsley or green onion. It is served today throughout the Richmond and Williamsburg area, at the taverns of Colonial Williamsburg, at the Hotel Roanoke's Regency Room, which has served it since the dining room opened in 1939, at the Wayside Inn in Middletown, the oldest continuously operating inn in the United States, opened since 1797. Richmond sits in the middle of the country ham belt that runs through central and southern Virginia, the region that produces the dry-cured, salt-cured hams that Virginia has been exporting and defending since the colonial period. A true Virginia country ham is salted, dry-cured for months, sometimes smoked over hickory, and aged until the meat develops a dense, intensely savory, almost mineral flavor that has no relationship to a supermarket ham. It is sliced paper thin. The slicing technique itself is a defended skill, and served on a biscuit, the salty ham balanced against the soft, slightly sweet bread. Smithfield, Virginia, an hour southeast of Richmond, has the most famous name in the tradition. But the technique of curing ham this way runs through the entire region, brought by English colonists who adapted European curing methods to the climate of the Virginia Tidewater and refined by generations of enslaved and free black cooks whose labor and knowledge built the ham curing industry that Virginia still claims credit for. This is not cornbread, and saying so in Richmond is a mistake worth avoiding. Spoonbread is a cornmeal custard. Beaten eggs and milk folded into a cornmeal base, baked until it rises like a soufflé, and sets into something with the texture of a savory pudding rather than a sliced bread. It is eaten with a spoon directly from the baking dish, never cut into squares, never treated as a vehicle for butter the way cornbread is. The dish appears on Richmond holiday tables as a permanent fixture. Families who have tried to retire it in favor of something more modern have generally been overruled. Spoonbread traces to the same Native American corn cooking traditions that produced Brunswick stew, refined over the colonial and antebellum periods into the specific custardy preparation that Virginia claims as uniquely its own. The dish requires a delicate hand. Too much liquid and it never sets. Too little, and it loses the soft, pudding-like quality that distinguishes it from ordinary cornbread. Before baking powder was commercially available, getting a biscuit to rise required actual labor. And in the plantation kitchens of antebellum Virginia, that labor was performed, almost without exception, by enslaved cooks who beat the dough by hand or with a mallet for as long as 30 minutes to develop the air pockets that would let the biscuit rise without any chemical leavening at all. A beaten biscuit is small, dense, and dry by design. Split open with a fork rather than cut, filled with a sliver of Virginia ham, eaten in a single bite. The dough is folded and beaten again, until it blisters slightly on the surface, a visual cue that the work is finished. The result has almost no air, in the way a modern fluffy biscuit has air. It is closer to a cracker, meant to be a sturdy portable vessel for the ham inside it. The dish survives in Richmond at the holiday tables and historic restaurants that have kept the antebellum Virginia biscuit tradition alive, even as the brutal physical labor that once produced it by hand has long since been replaced by a biscuit break, a mechanical device built specifically because no one wanted to beat dough by hand for half an hour any longer than necessary. The Hoecake is one of the oldest prepared foods in Virginia. A simple cornmeal batter mixed with water or buttermilk, cooked on a flat griddle, or, according to the most persistent, if disputed version of the story, originally cooked on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire by enslaved field workers who had no other cooking surface available to them at midday. Corn pone is the Hoecake's denser cousin, a thicker cornmeal cake, sometimes baked rather than fried, traditionally made without eggs or milk, just cornmeal, water, salt, and fat. Both dishes trace to the corn-growing and corn-processing knowledge of the indigenous peoples of the region, adapted by enslaved cooks into a food that required minimal ingredients and could be cooked quickly over a fire in the field or the cabin. Richmond's relationship to the Hoecake runs through the same line as its relationship to spoonbread and Brunswick stew. Dishes that began as food born from limited resources and forced labor, carried forward by the descendants of the people who created them, eventually adopted by the broader regional cuisine as a defining Virginia tradition. Richmond's deviled eggs are not a regional invention. The dish runs through the entire American South and traces even further back to ancient Rome, where eggs were boiled, seasoned, and served as a starter at banquets. But Richmond's specific commitment to the dish, and the specific seasoning blend most associated with the city's version, is its own small culinary signature. A Richmond deviled egg is built from hard-boiled eggs, the yolks mashed with mayonnaise, mustard, a dash of vinegar, and a generous amount of paprika dusted over the top, sometimes finished with a sliver of Virginia ham or a few capers, a nod to the country ham tradition that runs through everything else on this list. They appear at every Richmond church potluck, every holiday gathering, every funeral reception, served on a dedicated deviled egg plate that most Richmond grandmothers own, and most Richmond grandchildren have never seen used for anything else. In the early spring, the American shad, a member of the herring family, runs up the James River from the Atlantic to spawn, exactly as it has done for thousands of years, passing directly through the falls at Richmond on its way upstream. Shad roe, the egg sacs of the female fish, is a Richmond delicacy with a strict, narrow season, late February through April, when the fish are running and the roe is at its peak. It is pan-fried in butter, simply seasoned with salt and pepper, sometimes finished with a few strips of bacon cooked in the same pan. The roe has a rich, mineral, slightly grainy texture that has no real equivalent in the rest of American cooking. It is the specific taste of a fish that has been swimming up the same river since before the city existed. The Richmond Shad roe season was once a civic event. Restaurants built menus around it. Fishmongers along the river timed their entire spring around the run. Overfishing and dam construction have reduced the shad population dramatically since the mid-20th century, and the once-abundant spring tradition is now a more precious, limited annual event than it was a century ago. Richmonders who remember the larger runs treat the dish with a specific reverence that younger diners, encountering it for the first time, don't always understand until they taste it. This is the Richmond food that requires the most explanation outside city limits, and the one that most defines the specific, slightly stubborn character of the city's food culture. The sailor, sometimes sailor's sandwich, is a Richmond deli tradition. A layered sandwich built on rye bread, typically combining corned beef or pastrami with coleslaw and Russian or Thousand Island dressing, pressed and grilled until the bread crisps and the cheese inside fully melts. It bears a family resemblance to a Reuben, but Richmond delis that have served it for generations are firm that it is its own sandwich, with its own name, and the comparison to the Reuben is the kind of thing a visitor says once and is gently corrected on. The sandwich's name and exact origin are murky in the way that most great deli sandwiches are murky, passed down through specific delis and specific families rather than documented in any official record. What is not murky is the loyalty. Richmonders who grew up eating the sailor at a specific neighborhood deli will drive across the city for the version they consider correct and have opinions about the versions they consider incorrect that they are happy to share unprompted. The James River, where it widens toward the Chesapeake Bay below Richmond, has supported an oyster fishery since long before the city was founded. The Powhatan and other indigenous nations of the Tidewater region harvested oysters from these waters for thousands of years, leaving behind shell middens that archaeologists still study today. The oyster beds of the lower James were, for much of Virginia's colonial and early American history, among the most productive in the Chesapeake Bay system, second only to the bay's own legendary abundance. Richmond, sitting upriver at the falls, received oysters hauled up from the Tidewater by boat and later by rail, and the city's oyster bars and seafood houses built a culture around them that persisted for 2 centuries. Like the Chesapeake's oyster population generally, the James River fishery collapsed through the 20th century under the pressure of overharvesting, disease, and pollution. Restoration efforts over the past 2 decades, oyster sanctuaries, replanted reefs, aquaculture operations growing oysters in floating cages along the river, have begun rebuilding what was lost.